All right, hello, good afternoon. Thank you for registering for the webinar. This is CCUS Dialogues before the Roadshow, our second session. I'm Michelle Littlefield, Program Coordinator with the USEA Consensus Program, and we have Alex Krauka, Senior Program Coordinator, working the slides for us. And just a little bit on our program, formerly named Building Consensus on Carbon Capture, Utilization and Storage, and Clean Coal Technologies. Consensus for short, is a cooperative agreement with the Department of Energy, Fossil Energy. The program educates the public, policymakers, industry, and stakeholders on CCUS and clean coal technologies by hosting webinars such as these, along with a series of monthly educational briefings, conference workshops, technical reports, and we release monthly news clips of CCUS and clean coal related updates. If you would like to join our mailing list, if you have not done so already, feel free to send an email to the address at the bottom of the screen, and we will add you to our subscribers. Our program today with our moderator, Mike Moore, Director with the Consensus Program at USEA, is with Hunter Johnston, Partner at Steptoe and Johnston LLP, Shanon Angielski, Principal of Government Affairs at Ness Feldman, and serves as the Executive Director of the Carbon Utilization Research Council. And finally, Jeffrey Bobeck, Senior Advisor with the Center of Climate and Energy Solutions. In the last 20 minutes of the webinar, we will have a Q&A session. If you have a question you would like to ask, please submit your question in the Q&A chat box. And thank you all for joining us today. With that, I hand it over to Mike Moore.
Michelle, thank you very much. And thank you, Shannon and Hunter and Jeff, for being able to join us today. And thank you to the people who have taken their time to taken out of their day to be a participant in this program. There's a lot going on in carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and of course we're going through the COVID window, and there's going to be a point where we'll be post-COVID, and the big question is what does this look like when we come out? What kind of activities can we expect or anticipate, and more importantly, what kind of things are going on now that are going to be there when we emerge out of this the place we're at with COVID. We're going to hear from Hunter Johnston, who's got a lot of time and depth in the 45Q work that's been done out there, and it's the recently expanded version of it with the recent guidance from and regulations from the IRS have been put out so that we can work with that and begin to move forward. And we'll hear a lot about that from Hunter. Shannon is going to give us a good rundown on what's been going on the Hill, things that have been percolating there, some of the funding programs that have been going on at the DOE, and some of the important components of what drives CCUS forward. And Jeff recently coming off the back of some work at what it takes for a state to grab hold of and initiate CCS and low carbon economies is going to give us a background on that, having just recently done this for the state of Pennsylvania last week. With that, I'm going to start with Hunter and let you go. I believe you've got slides you want to start with, and I'm going to turn those to you.
Thank you, Mike. I hope you can hear me. I'm Hunter Johnston with Steptoe and Johnston Law Firm. I appreciate the opportunity to present today, and I want to thank the U.S. Energy Association and Mike, you in particular, for giving me this time. I will attempt to summarize the proposed regulations on 45Q that were published in late May on the 28th and hit some high points. Bear with me because the issues are technical in nature and the proposed regulation is 108 pages long. So I'm going to try to hit the high points, as I said. All in all, the proposed regulations are a big first step towards creating a regulatory framework supporting tax equity investment in carbon capture in the United States. But issues remain for potential clarification. The comment process is going to be ongoing in the next 60 days. If you turn to the first slide that I have, the first topic that I'm going to cover is the provision which provides an additional pathway for secure geologic storage, perhaps the biggest topic and something that's probably drawn the most attention. As an introduction, notice 2009-83, which is the key guidance under the old Section 45Q credit program, was issued while the EPA was still writing the greenhouse gas reporting rules. This had created some uncertainty as to the precise requirements for adequate security measures that must be adopted to demonstrate secure geologic storage. In general, operators who inject carbon oxide must do so under an appropriate EPA underground injection control well permit. Class 2 permits generally are used for wells that inject fluids, including carbon oxides, for enhanced oil recovery. Class 6 permits generally are used for wells which inject carbon oxides for the purpose of geologic sequestration and not for use in enhanced oil recovery. Class 6 wells are required to comply with the more stringent rules under subpart RR of the greenhouse gas reporting rules. Class 2 wells are permitted to comply with the less stringent rules under subpart UU of the same rules, but may opt into subpart RR reporting. The subpart RR rules require an EPA-approved site-specific monitoring, reporting, and verification plan, so-called MRV plan, but the subpart UU rules do not require an MRV plan. Historically, some taxpayers have taken the position that reporting under subpart RR is not required to claim a Section 45Q credit in the context of injection of qualified carbon oxides in EOR at a Class 2 well. The IRS, however, took the position that an approved MRV plan is required in order to demonstrate secure geologic storage, but this position was only expressed in the instructions to Form 8933, which is not binding guidance. In addition, some taxpayers were concerned that being required to opt into subpart RR may create a misalignment with state mineral property and natural resource conservation laws, as well as accepted industry practices and commercial arrangements. The proposed regulations clarify the meaning of secure geologic storage and provide an additional pathway beyond compliance with subpart RR. Under the proposed regulations, the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, standard on sequestration endorsed by the American National Standards Institute, ANSI, can be used as an alternative for UIC Class 2 wells. Both subpart RR and the ISO standard require an assessment and monitoring of potential leakage pathways, quantification of inputs, losses, and storage through a mass balance approach, and documentation of steps and approaches. Under the proposed regulations, operators of USC Class 2 wells that follow the ISO standard could elect to report to the EPA under subpart UU. Could elect to report under subpart RR, but were not required to do so. Rather, they could continue to report to the EPA under subpart UU. The proposed regulations do not provide an alternative to subpart RR reporting for Class 6 wells because all UIC Class 6 wells are already subject to subpart RR reporting requirements. Taxpayers that rely on the ISO standard must satisfy additional certification requirements. A taxpayer that reports volumes of carbon dioxide to the EPA pursuant to subpart RR may self-certify the volume of carbon dioxide claimed for purposes of Section 45Q. In contrast, if a taxpayer determines volumes pursuant to the ISO standard, the taxpayer may prepare documentation as outlined in the standard internally, but such documentation must be provided to a qualified independent engineer or geologist, who then must certify that the documentation provided, including the mass balance calculations, as well as information regarding monitoring and containment assurance, is accurate and complete. Some of the commentators advocating for the application of the ISO standard suggested that the proposed regulations require that all relevant documentation of the amount of qualified carbon dioxide stored for purposes of the Section 45Q credit be retained and made available for public review, and the total quantity of qualified carbon dioxide stored for long-term containment be reported annually. However, Treasury explained in the preamble to the proposed regulations that while Treasury appreciates the importance of shared and open information in this context and encourages transparency, congressional action would be required to mandate this kind of disclosure. The preamble explains that there is no statutory requirement in Section 45Q for taxpayers, federal agencies, or industry groups to publicly display this information or otherwise make it available. In addition, the Treasury itself is limited in what it can disclose because of the rules prohibiting the public disclosure of taxpayer information under Section 6103 of the code. Turning to the next issue, This issue relates to rules for contractual assurance of secure geologic storage. The proposed regulations clarify which contract provisions are necessary to contractually ensure a capture and disposal and secure geologic storage using a tertiary injectant in EOR or utilization as described in section 45Q(F)(5), which is the utilization provision. This is important because the taxpayer is not required to physically carry out the disposal, injection, or utilization of carbon dioxide to claim the credit if the taxpayer contractually ensures in a binding written contract that the party that physically carries out the disposal or utilization of the CO2 does so in a manner required under the section 45Q rules and regulations. In particular, the person who may claim the section 45Q credit is, for facilities placed in service before February 9, 2018, the person who captures or physically or contractually ensures the disposal of the CO2. And for facilities placed in service after February 8, 2018, the person that owns the carbon capture equipment and physically or contractually ensures the capture or utilization of the CO2. Under the proposed regulations, in order to contractually ensure disposal, injection, or utilization, a taxpayer must enter into a binding written contract. A written contract will be considered binding only if it is enforceable under state law under both against both the taxpayer and the party that physically carries out the disposal or utilization of the CO2, or a predecessor or successor of either, and doesn't limit damages to a specified amount. A taxpayer may enter into multiple binding written contracts with multiple parties for such disposal or utilization. In addition, several contract provisions are required or permitted. The contracts must include commercially reasonable terms and provide for enforcement of the party's obligations for CO2 that's intended to be disposed or injected, obligate the parties to comply with subpart RR rules or ISO standards, and comply with other requirements related to recapture, promptly informing the capturing party of all information pertinent to recapture, including leaks and the value of the credit that may have been lost. For qualified carbon dioxide intended to be utilized, they must obligate the utilizing party to comply with regulations governing utilization. Contracts may include also long-term liability provisions, indemnity provisions, penalties for breach of contract, liquidated damages, information of including how many metric tons of qualified oxide were agreed to be disposed or utilized, minimum quantities in that regard as well. These rules will help guide taxpayers in drafting contracts that will meet this contractual assurance standard. As a result, this helps promote certainty. At least one gap perhaps remains in these rules. Many commentators requested flexibility in allowing a chain of contractual assurance so that, for example, a taxpayer who owns carbon capture equipment could contract with a person who transports qualified CO2, who in turn could contract with a third person who physically carries out the disposal. The proposed regulations do not directly address this issue. It would be helpful if final regulations clarified with an example that direct contractual privity between the taxpayer to which the credit is attributable and the person who physically does the disposal or injection or utilization is not required as long as there is a chain of contractual privity. The third issue I'll cover is on the transfer election. The transfer provision provides that the taxpayer to which credit is attributable may elect to allow the person that disposes of the CO2 or utilizes the CO2 to instead claim the credit. The proposed regulations provide guidance regarding that election. It says that the elections may be made for all or a portion of the available credit and may be made for a single or multiple credit claimants. The electing taxpayer must provide the relevant form, which is Form 8933 to do it. And it specifies that the elections must be made on an annual basis. These provisions should allow greater flexibility for taxpayers who wish to change a section 45Q F3B election from year to year or transfer portions of the credit to multiple parties. Guidance regarding the interaction of this transfer election and the guidance on that had previously been published in Revenue Procedure 2020-12 would be helpful to explain how the partnership allocations and the transfer election could work together. The fourth issue that I would like to cover is this broad definition of carbon capture equipment. The proposed regulations included definitions of key terms that were left undefined. The proposed regulations provide in general that carbon capture equipment includes all components of property that are used to capture or process carbon dioxide until the carbon dioxide is transported for disposal. The regs list specific items that are included in or excluded from the definition, components of property related to the function of capturing carbon oxides, like compression and treatment and processing, are included within the definition of equipment. Components relating to transporting the CO2, carbon oxides, however, is not included in that definition. However, a single gathering and distribution system that collects and transports carbon dioxide to a pipeline is considered carbon capture equipment. This broad definition means that multiple distinct pieces of equipment that produce a single stream of CO2 may be treated as carbon capture equipment. For example, one piece of equipment might separate carbon dioxide from other gases, while another piece of equipment might compress the CO2, with the third piece of equipment treating the CO2. This may create confusion because the Section 45Q credit generally is attributed to the owner of the carbon capture equipment at a qualified facility. The proposed regulations do not address the consequences if more than one taxpayer owns distinct pieces of equipment that all produce a single stream of carbon dioxide. Is a taxpayer required to own all of the carbon capture equipment that produces a single stream in order to claim the credit? Or is the taxpayer only required to own a portion of such equipment? If the latter, does the credit need to be apportioned among different taxpayers that own different portions? And if so, how will the credit be apportioned? I think this is a really important area for clarification. Also would like to address the issue of an industrial facility. In general, in order to be a qualified facility under 45Q, a facility must either be a direct air capture facility or an industrial facility. The proposed regs generally follow the prior sub-regulatory guidance on the meaning of an industrial facility. Consistent with the prior guidance, the proposed regs provide that industrial facility is a facility that produces a carbon dioxide stream from a fuel combustion source or fuel cell, a manufacturing process, a fugitive carbon dioxide emission source that, absent capture or disposal, would otherwise be released in the atmosphere as industrial emission of greenhouse gas or lead to such release. Also consistent with this guidance, the proposed regulations provide that industrial facility does not include a facility that produces carbon dioxide from carbon dioxide production wells at natural carbon dioxide bearing formations or naturally occurring subsurface spring. However, the proposed regulations expand on the prior guidance. The proposed regulations provide that a deposit of natural gas that contains less than 10% carbon dioxide by volume is not a natural carbon dioxide bearing formation. And this is really important. For other deposits, whether a well is producing from a natural carbon dioxide bearing formation is based on all the facts and circumstances. The proposed regs also define the term manufacturing process as a process involving the manufacture of products other than carbon dioxide that are intended to be sold at a profit or used for a commercial purpose. All of the facts and circumstances with respect to the process of products are to be taken into account. As illustrated by the proposed regs, if a natural gas reservoir contains both CO2 and methane, then the taxpayer constructs equipment to separate two and enters in the contract to sell only the CO2. The separation process is not a manufacturing process. But if a taxpayer separates and sells both gases, it would be a manufacturing process. So this is very helpful to gas processors out there. I would now like to address the utilization framework that's laid out in the regs, which previously had not been subject to regulation. The original, the Bipartisan Budget Act describes carbon utilization, which in a way where it means the fixation of qualified carbon dioxide through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, such as growing algae or bacteria, or the chemical conversion of such qualified carbon dioxide to a material or chemical compound in which the qualified carbon dioxide is securely stored, or the use of such qualified carbon dioxide for any other purpose for which a commercial market exists, with the exception of use as a tertiary injection in an EOR well, as determined by the Treasury Secretary. The section provides a methodology to determine the amount of qualified carbon dioxide utilized by the taxpayer. Such amount is equal to the metric tons of qualified carbon dioxide which the taxpayer demonstrates based on an analysis of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions and subject to such requirements as the Treasury Secretary in consultation with DOE and EPA determines appropriate, in which capture and permanently isolates from the atmosphere or displaces from being emitted into the atmosphere through use of a process described in 45Q F5A. The term life cycle greenhouse gas emissions in 45Q is given the same meaning as the term under the Clean Air Act in effect on February 9th, 2018, except that the word product is substituted for the word fuel in each place it appears in the Clean Air Act. Under the Clean Air Act, net emissions of all greenhouse gases, and not just carbon oxides, must be taken into account with the mass values for each greenhouse gas adjusted to account for its relative global warming potential. This is another very important area of the statute. Treasury, in consultation with EPA and the DOE, concluded that a life cycle analysis in LCA must be in writing and either performed or verified by a professionally licensed third party using generally accepted standards of practices of quantifying the greenhouse gas emissions of a product or process and comparing that impact to a baseline. In particular, the analysis must contain documentation consistent with ISO standard 14044:2006, which is the life cycle environmental management assessment, as well as stated documents documenting the qualifications of the third party. The proposed regulations further require a taxpayer to submit an LCA to report to the IRS, and the DOE. The LCA will be subject to a technical review by DOE and the IRS in consultation with DOE and EPA, and will determine whether to approve the LCA. So DOE has really a front and center role in determining the LCA. Treasury requested comments on how to achieve consistency in boundaries and baselines so that similarly situated taxpayers will be treated consistently. The preamble also states that Treasury is willing to consider issuing guidance on particular fact patterns. Treasury did not comprehensively address all issues related to utilization, however, reserving several complex issues for further regulation, including standards for an LCA and the definition of a commercial market. Importantly, the regulations include the recognition that in an LCA, greenhouse gas emissions means the aggregate quantity of emissions where the mass values for all greenhouse gases are adjusted to account for global warming potential. So this really is extremely important because it means that other greenhouse gases other than carbon oxides are involved with this area of the statute. Briefly, I want to talk about the next issue, which is the 5-year look-back period, which has been introduced for the credit recapture. There's always been recapture in 45Q, although in 2009, 83 noticed that there was some guidance on the recapture provision. The absence of comprehensive guidance and the open-ended nature of recapture risk has been a big impediment to the 45Q tax credit. The prior proposed regulations address this prior uncertainty by proposing a comprehensive guidance and a 5-year look-back period. The proposed regulations provide that any recapture amount will be accounted for in the taxable year that is identified and reported. If during the recapture period, a taxpayer determines that qualified CO2 is linked into the atmosphere, the taxpayer will have a recapture amount if the leaked amount of qualified carbon dioxide exceeds the amount of qualified carbon dioxide disposed of in secure geologic storage or used as a tertiary injectant in that taxable year. If the leaked amount does not exceed the amount captured, it will reduce the amount stored or injected for purposes of claiming the credit in the current year. The excess amount of leaked qualified carbon dioxide will be recaptured at a credit rate calculated on a LIFO basis. That is, the excess leaked qualified carbon dioxide will be deemed attributed initially to the first preceding year, then to the second preceding year, and then up to the fifth preceding year to simplify the calculation of the recapture amount. The taxpayer must also add the amount of recaptured Section 45Q tax credit to the amount of tax due in the taxable year in which the recapture event occurs. So consistent with this 5-year look-back period, the proposed regulations provide that the recapture period will end on the earlier of the 5 years after the last taxable year in which the taxpayer claimed a Section 45Q credit, or the date monitoring ends under the subpart RR rules or the ISO standard. Treasury has requested comments on how to apply the recapture provisions to Section 45Q credits that are carried forward to future tax years due to insufficient tax liability in the current year. Some taxpayers may be concerned that a 5-year look-back period and or a 5-year post-credit claiming period may be too long. Many commentators suggested shorter periods. The Carbon Capture Coalition, for instance, recommended a 1-year look-back. Taken together, because of the what leading experts have had to say about subsurface geologic storage of carbon oxide, thinking about physics and flow mechanics and experience with tools for subsurface management of buoyant fluids combined with regulatory requirements suggests that cases of loss of volumes of carbon oxide which would approach commercial volumes sequestered during a 2-year period are highly improbable. And potential carbon dioxide losses occur principally during injection or early in a project while a field is being actively monitored for injection pressures and conformance. This kind of evidence tends to support a substantially shorter look-back period in post-credit claiming period. Treasury did, however, request comments on the length of the look-back period. In conclusion, while some questions remain, the proposed regulations are an important first step in providing investors in carbon capture projects with certainty that is needed for robust development of the carbon capture industry. The government has permitted reliance on the proposed regulations, so they do give taxpayers comfort to use what's out there, even though they're not in final form. There's a 60-day comment period. That took a lot to go through, but I did want to touch on the next slide several proposals that are pending in Congress relative to improvement of the 45Q tax credit. There is a proposal that has been introduced relative to direct pay, primarily on the House side by House Democrats. Direct pay would be would provide, if applied to 45Q, would provide the potential to avoid tax equity markets and treat a 45Q tax credit as if it were an overpayment of taxes on a tax return. So it would provide for the opportunity to get a direct payment from the federal government for the 45Q tax credit. I have an explanation in more detail about what direct pay is, but if you go to the next slide, there are, as I mentioned, that the Green Act by House Ways and Means Democrats, that was proposed in November 2019 in the context of renewables. Congressman Blumenauer's bill was HR 5157 that was introduced in the same month. There are currently 2 conceptual proposals that are out there. One related, one by Congressman Arrington, not Congresswoman. I apologize to the congressman for that. that would use the general business credit section of Section 38 to provide potential refundable credits. And then a second one that's being discussed by the Advanced Energy Economy is a proposal that would mirror the direct pay proposal, but require a 50% domestic content requirement in order to get the tax credit. So with that, I appreciate everyone's attention, going over a very technical area of the tax code, and I'll be available to answer questions after the other presentations. Thank you.
Hunter, thank you very much. And by the way, great job taking 100 and some pages of latest updates and guidance changes and condensed it into 5 or 6 slides. It was hard. Thank you. A lot of material there. He'll be available offline as well. His contact information will be on his presentation material. So, Hunter, and there'll be some Q&A at the end. So anything for Hunter, we'll hold for that. We're going to move on over to Shanon. And Shanon, thank you again for taking your time to be here and take us down the path of what's going on as you see there at the Carbon Utilization Resource Center. So Research Council. So here is Shanon. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you also for the invitation and to USEA for hosting these webinar series in lieu of being able to do them in person. So I'm glad that you are keeping up the momentum and glad to see the participation. There's I'm showing 118 right now, so that's a pretty significant number, and hopefully it's by virtue of many of the things that we're doing here. So if you can go to the next slide, I just want to introduce CURC, which is the organization I'm here representing today. As you can see, we have a broad swath of the supply chain that's focused on the utilization of fossil fuels, mainly as it is related to the utility and electric power generation industry. But we have been focused on the development of technology solutions for the responsible use of our fossil energy resources for over 2 decades now as an organization, and have been working on CCUS issues for almost that same period of time. So if you go to the next slide, please. I thought what I would do was piggyback off of Hunter's discussion on 45Q and the regs, and I am only providing a few examples, and this is in no way in order of any type of priority or otherwise. It's just a sampling of some of the projects that were announced as a result of both the passage of the 45Q tax credits, but also anticipation of what the regulations might look like. And as you can see, we have investment impact showing at least what 45Q did when it was enacted was actually incentivize a new tax credit market. And so we're seeing not just financial investment institutions, but other types of investors like the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative making investments in many of these projects. And so here are just a couple of those that were announced last year, but the Low Carbon Ventures, Oxy Low Carbon Ventures investment in Net Power's technology, as well as in the Wabash Valley Resources project, are very interesting, and they're investing in a variety of different types of CCUS projects. If you go to the next slide, what I wanted to show essentially is that despite living in this quarantine world and the world of COVID-19, we have seen some recent announcements, and perhaps some of them just ahead of the real quarantine period. But I think it's good to just highlight and make note of the fact that there's still a lot of activity. As we all know, we are very busy right now, even as we work remotely for many of us. But this graphic shows you at least some recent examples during this time, and the most recent of which is the Starwood Energy project, where you also see groups like OGCI and another investment firm coming out investing in a project at I'm sorry, I have a cement plant there, but that should say natural gas combined cycle plant. So in any event, I think that this is just very good news and wanted to flag that for folks. So going to the next slide, there are other forms of federal financial support, and I just wanted to show, you can't really see the one at the bottom, but there are good 8 funding opportunity announcements that have been issued by the Department of Energy and the Office of Fossil Energy for carbon capture, utilization, and storage. The Department of Energy has a world-class carbon capture and storage program, and they continue to get some robust funding for undertaking technology initiatives. Thus far, you can see that they are looking at a variety of different applications of carbon capture and utilization technologies. And so I wanted to at least identify both the variety as well as the funding levels that they are proposing for some of these projects. And this will really help to accelerate new innovative technologies. And with the incentive of the 45Q tax credits also out there, it will act to continue to incentivize those technologies up through a potential commercial deployment scenario. As we all know, if you switch to the next slide, in addition to developing what are carbon capture technologies or processes or other tools for capturing CO2, we have to do something with the CO2. And DOE also has something called it's a program called the Carbon Storage Assurance Facility Enterprise Initiative, or CarbonSAFE initiative. And essentially this program focuses on the development of geologic storage sites for the storage of what their goal is 50+ million metric tons of CO2 from industrial sources. And so what these projects are designed to accomplish is to integrate carbon capture sources of CO2 with sinks in saline reservoirs. And they will ultimately result or take form of like a regional hub, a geologic regional storage capture and storage hub. And as you can see, they have attempted to diversify the geographic locations of these. I think, quite frankly, their budget isn't sufficient to accommodate the number of geographic locations that we could see on this map, but that is one effort that we hope to accomplish, which is to get additional CarbonSAFE projects launched with federal funds as well. But if you take a look at all of these projects, and you can see here on this next slide, you can go ahead to the feed slide. One thing I want to make note of is that several of the carbon capture projects that were awarded for these DOE, what are called the front-end engineering and design studies, they will serve as the source of CO2 for the phase 3 CarbonSAFE projects. You can see the project in New Mexico for the San Juan generating station. You could see the project in Alabama for the Southern Company project, looking at both coal and gas plants there. You can see the Prairie State generating project in Illinois, as well as the Minn-Kota Power Cooperative project in Grand Forks. I'll just say about these studies, there was an effort a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago, to advocate for funding for just this component of the project, meaning the FEED study, as an attempt to try to accelerate commercial scale projects. The theory being that with 45Q incentives available, once you have a FEED study put together, potentially projects could then go to financial investment firms and discuss terms for financing based on their project and based on the ability to utilize the 45Q tax credits. That won't be true for all projects, and in particular, it won't be true necessarily for all, for power projects. But it's an attempt to try to bring something that's already in a wrap and deliver that for financial discussions. So what I wanted to do was, on the next slide, just dive a little deeper in terms of just an overview of a project and doing a little bit of a project scenario. I will say that 45Q and Project Tundra would also say that 45Q changes everything. Project Tundra is the project that is located in North Dakota, and is going to use is going to retrofit Unit 2 at the Milton R. Young Station with a technology, and that is owned by Minn Kota Power Cooperative, as well as Square Butte Electric Cooperative. They will be capturing at least 95% of the CO2. This is a mine mouth plant, as most of the plants are in North Dakota, operated by BNI, which is an elite company. And so this will be the first carbon capture project in the U.S. that's operating on lignite coal. As of right now, as you can see from that graphic, the CO2 that will be captured is going initially into a CO2 sequestration site, and that is the North Dakota CarbonSAFE project site. So they have the source and the sink linked up together. They're also evaluating a lengthy pipeline. As you can see, it would be about 100 miles to take CO2 to the Williston Basin oil and gas fields to potentially put CO2 into those reservoirs for oil production, enhanced oil production. So why did I title this as 45Q Changes Everything? I would say that a $50 per ton of CO2 for permanent geologic storage, that equates to, at least for this project, almost a $2 billion potential incentive. The challenge, I think, is pointed out already by Hunter, is that Minn Kota is an electric cooperative, so they don't pay taxes in the same way that most do. And so as a result, they don't have that tax liability to monetize these 45Q tax credits. So they will have to, under the current structure of the 45Q program, they will have to enter into a tax equity partnership in order to monetize fully these tax credits. I would say that at least moving into recovery, there's concerns about what could be limited tax liability over the next several years for tax equity partners to also be able to bring the full liability to the table in order to monetize all of the tax credits. So that is one concern that many in this industry have. The other is that there are a limited number of firms that have tax equity investment bureaus, and CCUS projects currently have to compete in the tax equity market with wind and solar projects. And even despite the phase out of those tax credits, there's a comfort level that's already been established with wind and solar projects, and there are so many of them operating that the risk profile is so much smaller than some of these first of a kind CCUS projects. So there is concern about some of these challenges that might lay ahead under the current structure of the 45Q tax credit program. So that's why several stakeholders are engaging the policymakers on making changes to the 45Q program to elect for a cash payment in lieu of that tax credit. So last slide, I thought I would just close with this. There is an open letter from the CEOs of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which I found to be pretty important, particularly in these times, but I won't read that. But I thought I would close with their thoughts and thinking about the need for effective policy and infrastructure investments in order for us are going to be needed, and they emphasize that in order to address the scale of climate change, and that will be through innovation and with CCUS technologies, which is one of the key priorities of this group. But that they are not walking away from this, and that they are crystallizing around this as an important aspect of going forward from a recovery perspective. So with that, I'll end there, and thank you again, and turn it back over to Mike.
And thank you very much. And there's a lot of moving pieces here. And like you said, the 45Q is changing a lot of the thought process, just like we're seeing with Project Tundra. I'm sure there's 2 or 3 other projects that are under wraps that we've not heard much about at the moment. And there's the industrial piece as well. Hunter, I know we didn't talk about it here, but you've been a part of the Lake Charles methanol project for a number of years. This benefits from this as well. So there's a lot of good moving pieces here. For questions for Shanon at the end, when we get done with Jeff, Bobeck, we'll go to the Q&A session. And again, these materials will be available on our website, and Shannon's contact information will be in the slides as well if you wanted to follow up with her privately on questions. With that, I'll turn this over to Jeff from C2ES, and you've got some good insights now, having just come off this program with Pennsylvania last week.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate it. And let's all hope the roadshow gets back on the road soon. Shanon brought up the CarbonSAFE Phase 3 program, and that's very important. And I want to touch on that briefly. And when I say briefly, I mean it. I won't keep you long here because I know we're short on time. First of all, though, I'd like to do a quick political reality check as we're talking about what the post-coronavirus world can look like in our little corner of it. You know, carbon capture has long relied on bipartisan support in Washington. And there was a hearing back on February 6th, long ago, if we can remember back that far, and the Energy and Commerce Committee, where we saw some divisions, at least on the Democratic side. And it was likely now that the Use It bill won't pass this year. And kind of looking forward, I just wonder if we can count on that kind of bipartisan support out of Washington. Having said that, there's been so much achieved through 45Q, and now the regs are out, that really the burden may land somewhere else besides Washington. There also have been some increasing calls for working to somehow keep the emissions gains that have occurred due to the economic downturn. That usually entails calls for quicker ramp up of renewables, and that may leave carbon capture behind because that also implies some opposition to all fossil generation at all. So that's something we have to think about. So I won't try and be an election prognosticator, but suffice to say that now that the 45Q regs are out, it really does make us turn to the states. You know, like politics, you could say all CCUS projects are local, and it makes sense that the real drivers for actual projects come from the states. The National Petroleum Council described a dual challenge that carbon capture can help us meet, that dual challenge being lowering emissions while providing secure, affordable energy. Actually, for the states, there are many challenges that carbon capture can help them to meet. But again, the ball is in their individual courts. Alex, next slide. The very first thing states need to do is, at its most basic, recognize that abated fossil energy emissions are a key component of sound climate and energy plans. Now that sounds simple, but a traditional renewable portfolio standard essentially doesn't leave room to account for gains from carbon capture. In other words, if you cut the emissions from a fossil plant, it doesn't count toward your renewables. So the first thing is we'd like to see more states adopt broader clean energy standards that account for all lower carbon sources of energy. Secondly, states can take control of how CO2 is transported and stored, and especially stored. You know, the EPA grants Class 6 permits for CO2 geologic storage. States, though, can seek primacy for storage permitting, which will speed up the process and, most importantly, give them a stronger role in the overall process. And finally, states can determine how carbon capture fits into their own energy and climate planning, and whether it can also be an economic development boost rather than a burden. And one way to do this, and next slide, please, Alec. One way to do this, we believe, is the hub and cluster system that was alluded to earlier. I like this graphic because it has nice little models of it. This is a schematic of how a hub and cluster system would work in northeastern England in the Humber region. Of course, there they contemplate offshore CO2 storage. But you can see there's a power plant connected to industrial sources of emissions. And last but not least, you'll notice right up there at the top is a hydrogen production facility. So by this way, if you're a state trying to do your planning, you're realizing at least 3 or 4 benefits all at once, not just 1 or 2. Next slide. And this is a different schematic of really the same thing, but you can see all the different types of facilities that could be joined together. A power station, a refinery, a chemical facility, manufacturing. And also, you know, we heard a little bit about carbon utilization under 45Q from Hunter earlier. And carbon utilization can be an important local driver of the economy. Once again, if states see it that way. So, next slide. C2ES held a webinar last week to look at how one particular state could develop carbon capture as part of its own climate planning. And I want to thank our good friends at Clean Air Task Force for coming up with this nice map. You can see a lot of times if you just plot everything, it really suggests how hubs and clusters can work. And in fact, the most likely place for a hub and cluster in the state of Pennsylvania would be the southwest corner of the state. That also happens to be a good location for storage. And next slide, please. When you think about transportation, in Pennsylvania, you have to think of the mountains cutting through the middle of the state. And this little map, again, thanks to the Clean Air Task Force, shows us where the existing gas transmission and other types of hazardous liquid lines run. So in fact, this shows us where you might have rights of way for CO2 pipelines. And since you have all the sources nearby, this seems like it would be the perfect place to build a hub and cluster system. But again, the important thing, and next slide please, Alec. The important thing is for states to take the lead themselves in trying to commercialize carbon capture. Having a big plan that incorporates clusters, incorporates CO2 transportation and storage, and takes control of the permitting will help bring down the cost of deployment. And most importantly, we think it will create an economic boon. So I'm going to stop right there because I know we want to leave time for questions, and I'll turn it back to you, Mike.
Jeff, thank you very much for that, and Hunter and Shannon as well. We've got a lot of content here. So I got just a question that kind of pops up on my end of the world. With the idea of hubs and clusters and regional development, has there been a gathering of regional, I'd say regional minds and entities to kind of map out an area that might be the next likely hub and cluster sector to pay attention to in the United States? Where would be the most likely CO2 capture start taking place, infrastructure getting built, and a marketplace for the output of for the program that would be capturing CO2, for example? I know a while back, not long ago, not a while back, that Oxy was looking at a big Midwest kind of infrastructure play. Are there things like that in the arc of the Gulf Coast that could take advantage of all the things we're just talking about?
Sure. Well, again, I want to have a shout out to another NGO, our friends at the Great Plains Institute, because they've been leading a state deployment initiative that really has started with the mapping of how, what the best economic routes for pipelines would be. And that's primarily to feed EOR, but in a longer term to feed saline storage. But that's just really one way to get a bite of the apple. Again, a state like Pennsylvania is not likely to participate in something that pushes CO2 all the way to the Permian Basin. So they've got to incorporate their own climate planning and how they could make this work.
All right, Shannon or Hunter? Yeah, Hunter.
My answer would be that you're going to find clusters in areas of the country where there are large sources of pure CO2 streams combined with proximity to geophysical characteristics, areas, whether it's saline storage or oil fields, and also proximity to existing pipeline infrastructure. That's where the opportunities are for clusters to form in the short term. And it's no secret where those places are. You're talking about principally Louisiana and Texas.
Right. And I kind of, watch out west. You have what's going on in the Four Corners area with Enchant Energy looking to develop out in that area and have, I think, probably take advantage of the infrastructure that exists for CO2 to move that to the Permian or locally for brine storage as well. On the 45Q tax credit, do you have a sense of the size that this market could be in the next 5 years? We're all talking to a lot of different people. There's a lot of moving pieces that have to connect. It's kind of a long shot, but we have the Starwood, OGCI Elysian piece. We have with the guys with the cement plant. We have a couple of projects that are in the woods right now that are not in the public domain. There's 3 or 4, and then there's Enchant and the interests out there in New Mexico. I understand there might be something percolate in Indiana, something in Illinois. That's half a dozen projects right there. Is there a sense that there's more upwelling to that, or kind of a loaded question, I suppose, but.
It's a hard question to answer precisely, but clearly the low-hanging fruit in carbon capture is in the industrial sector. Again, because of the large sources of CO2, whether you're talking about potential targeting of fertilizer plants or LNG facilities. These are where the large amounts of, in refineries, these are where you find large amounts of CO2 industrial clusters. And when you think about the potential investment, we're talking billions and billions of dollars.
Right. Shannon?
Mike, what I was going to say is that, I mean, outside of the projects that I identified on that slide, there are definitely even more projects that are being announced, not just in the power sector. And then as, Hunter pointed out, there's at least, 7 to 9 projects that you could consider that are industrial or direct air capture that are in project development. You've got ethanol. I mean, there's a variety of different projects. So I think at the end of the day, the question is how quickly can they evolve and develop, and what kind of price point is going to be needed for the investment in those projects. And if those projects can launch under the current form of the tax equity structure, or if you don't need tax equity, then it's sort of like the first of the game. And I don't know how that happens in the next 5 years, because that's also obviously going to be marked by what happens with economic recovery.
Right. Of course, that's the $64,000 question right now, how we come out of all this as we move forward. Jeff Erickson just sent went out to all panels, so I'm going to repeat what he said. He's saying that in their work that they've done, they've added 16 new large-scale facilities in the U.S. in the last 10 months, mostly in early development. So it gives you an idea. There's a lot of people and a lot of different pieces of industry that are taking a hard bite of this. Of course, CSR ESG is a big driver for a lot of these firms as well. We had a question. I think it was a fair one. And of course, us in this space have come up to this more than once now. So it started out as to you, Hunter, but it's kind of to everybody. And it's from Jeff Epplink, and it's the Treasury Inspector General apparently has confirmed that fossil fuel companies in the past have improperly claimed nearly $900 million worth of 45Q tax credits. And his question is, how problematic is this going forward? And Hunter, if you want to take off with that, get to answer that, or.
Sure. I think that most of the response to the Inspector General's report has been to applaud the Internal Revenue Service, the Inspector General, and frankly, Senator Menendez for bringing light to calls for greater transparency with the tax credit. And I think that most people that I talk to in the carbon capture industry want more transparency. I do believe that in order to achieve that, it's going to require statutory change. As stated in the preamble to the proposed regulations, it's really, the Treasury Department was practically begging Congress to step in here and create a place where the amount of the credit and who's taking the credit could be registered. And it would have to be an exception, either an exception to the taxpayer secrecy laws or to file these reports that are required to be made every year to the IRS. You could make that available, for instance, by way of example, in the public disclosure tool that the EPA has for registering compliance with subpart RR. So you know, a taxpayer could upload that information, and I think that as long as the public better understands that basic information of who is claiming the credit and how they're disclosing it, then there'll be a lot more support for the 45Q tax credit. But I think it really, to preserve the integrity of 45Q, we need to have additional disclosure.
Mm-hmm. Shanon?
Hey, Mike, can I just say, I would say also that the way the program is working right now with being required to report under subpart RR, the program works in its current form, right? So I would just start with that point, which is that's exactly what the Inspector General's report found, right? And so that's why it was important that we know that the program in its current form was working. So there is transparency with that, at least in that process. I would say that also with the proposed regulations, I think as Hunter pointed out, there is an alternative that's been proposed through the ISO standard, and that standard requires very similar methodologies for accounting for your geologic storage. And as you said, they lack when I say they, I mean Treasury and IRS lack the ability to be able to require taxpayers to report some of this information. So to just kind of put an additional point to what Hunter was saying, whether it's statutory or some other way to try to at least provide that data that can be reported through the ISO program is something that will need to be figured out.
Sure. And Jeff, did you have anything to add to that? Because we'll wrap it up. And
no, they covered it well. All I can do is second and third those comments.
All right. Well, there's a few more questions we didn't get to. I appreciate the audience that sent them to us. They did not go unnoticed. What I would recommend is you have contact information for Hunter, Shanon, and Jeff off the presentations will be available. This will be available as a recorded video that you can pull down later. And with that, I'm going to just thank Shanon and Hunter and Jeff, and you too, Michelle, and Alex in the back over there as well to make this work. And one big shout out to the DOE for making sure things like these programs get a chance to go out and bring all this kind of intel and activity and motion to the table and let us put it out there. So to everybody, thanks. And Michelle, it's yours.
All right. Thank you, Mike. And of course, a big thank you to our speakers for the valuable insight on 45Q regulations and for giving us a vision of what we're looking at in the world of CCUS past the pandemic. And thank you to our audience for listening and submitting your questions. USEA's next event will be this Friday, June 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We're hosting a webinar on the role of hydrogen gas and renewable gas in decarbonization with speakers Lewin King, creator and executive producer and host of the White House Chronicles, and Mark Eisenhower and Dan Peters with Guidehouse Consultants. Registration is available on our website, usea.org/events. Once again, thank you all for joining us, and I hope everyone is being safe. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Mike.